Hello dear students, I am Dr. Prinpreet and today I am back again to talk about another topic, Establishing Property Rights Part 1. So just to introduce the topic of property rights which determine who owns, uses and transfers resources are fundamental to both legal and economic systems and influence how societies operate. The creation of property rights has been essential to the growth of affluent, stable and just societies from ancient times to contemporary economies. This lecture will explore the many facets of property rights, including their legal foundations, historical development, economic importance and current issues. It is impossible to understate the significance of property rights. They support social stability, stimulate investment and innovation and offer the legal certainty required for economic transactions. Property rights guarantee ownership, which encourages people and institutions to invest in and effectively manage resources, hence promoting economic development and progress. But creating and upholding property rights is a difficult process that frequently involves social, political and legal obstacles. The notion of establishing property rights is fundamental to both economics and law, and it has a big impact on social order, economic growth and resource distribution. Property rights are created through a multifaceted process that includes legal, social and economic aspects. These property rights, which cover possession, use and transfer, are crucial for social cohesion, economic growth and environmental preservation as well. The various facets of establishing property rights have been discussed ahead, along with their genesis in history, their legal underpinnings, the difficulties caused by social and cultural factors, and the significance of property rights in various contexts such as environmental conservation and developing nations. Now, let us first talk about the evolution of property rights in history. Over time, the idea of property rights has changed dramatically to reflect shifts in legal frameworks, economic systems and social structures. To comprehend property rights in their current form and the difficulties associated with establishing them, one must have a thorough understanding of their historical evolution. I'll first talk about ancient human communities and common property. There was little to no concept of private property rights in early human communities. Communities frequently shared resources like food, water, and land without having established official ownership systems. Customs and traditions frequently oversaw these shared property systems, guaranteeing that resources were allocated in accordance with the requirements of the society. Now, the evolution of private property in prehistoric societies tells us that private property rights first appeared as cultures moved from nomadic to agricultural. Individual ownership emerged as a result of the necessity for stable and secure access to land when agriculture became the main source of livelihood. Legal systems that acknowledged private property rights were established by ancient civilizations including Mesopotamia, Egypt and Greece, especially with regard to land and cattle. Land ownership served as a foundation for power and riches, and these rights were frequently associated with social standing. Property rights in the system of feudalism. Property rights in the Middle Ages were based on the feudal system in which vassals received land from the nobles in return to their allegiance and military duty. Peasants were given limited rights to utilize the land in exchange for their labor and a portion of the harvest, even though they worked on the land but did not own it. Property rights were established under this system in a hierarchical manner, with the monarchy or the ruling class holding the ultimate ownership. Modern property rights, their emergence in the age of enlightenment. The idea of property rights underwent substantial modification throughout the period of enlightenment. John Locke and other philosophers believed that people have an inherent right to possess property based on the labor that they put into it. Locke's ideas, which placed a strong emphasis on private property rights and state protection of private property, had an impact on the evolution of contemporary property rights. Property laws were codified in many Western countries as a result of the growth of capitalism, which further cemented private property rights as the foundation of economic systems. Now, let us move to talk about how property rights were changed under the colonial period. Native American communities were forced to adopt Western conceptions of property rights as a result of the growth of colonial empires under the European regime. Colonial powers frequently ignored customary land tenure arrangements, seizing property for their own use and upending long-standing social and economic institutions. Property rights are still impacted by colonialism in many regions of the world where resource and land disputes are still common. Now, we discuss the legal framework of the property rights. The legal ownership and control of resources such as real estate, manufactured goods, buildings, intellectual property and other assets is referred to as property rights. These rights provide people or organizations the ability to use, transfer or restrict others from using their property. Property rights are inextricably linked to the legal structures that govern their creation and maintenance. Although these frameworks differ from one country to the next, they all typically adhere to the same basic ideas that characterize and limit the property rights. Now, I will first discuss the fundamentals of property law. Property law is founded on a number of important ideas, the first one being exclusivity. The owner's power to forbid others from utilizing or entering their land, this is known as exclusivity. Second point here is transferability, the capacity to assign ownership or usage privileges to a different entity by way of a lease, sale or inheritance is what we call as transferability. And the third point, that is use, the freedom to use the land any way the owner pleases within the bounds of law. There is one more point here that I will be talking of, that is protection, the legal safeguards against infringement and unauthorized taking of the property rights. Now, the state's function in determining and upholding property rights is very important. Let us understand how does it work. Property rights are established and upheld in large part by the state. Governments establish institutions for property registration and titling, defining property rights through legislation and offer dispute resolution procedures. Property rights are also protected by the state through the courts and law enforcement. Now, let us make a comparative evaluation of property rights in different legal frameworks. Due to historical, cultural and economic influences, property rights differ greatly among legal systems across the world. Common law systems like those found in the US and the UK place a strong emphasis on private property ownership and unrestricted transfer of ownership. To strike a balance between the rights of the individual and the interests of the society, civil law systems like those in France and Germany may nevertheless place greater limitations on the use and transfer of property. Customary law, which is common in many indigenous and African societies, replaces formal legal systems with customary customs to regulate land and resource rights. Now, I will be talking of human rights and property rights from a legal perspective. Particularly when considering economic, social and cultural rights, property rights are becoming more widely acknowledged as essential components of human rights. The right to own property is protected by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR as we call it, and a number of international treaties also stress how crucial property rights are to the preservation of houses, livelihoods and cultural assets. But reconciling individual property rights with group social objectives can make the link between property rights and human rights quite complicated. Theories of economics concerning property rights. Economic systems are greatly impacted by the creation of property rights. The contribution of property rights to resource allocation, efficiency and innovation is explained by a number of economic theories. The first one amongst them is the property rights function in market economies. Market economies cannot operate without property rights. They give people and companies the legal assurance they need to make resource investments, trade and contract. Safeguarding property rights lowers the transaction costs, promotes the market exchanges and fosters entrepreneurship, all of which contribute to the expansion and prosperity of the economy. Property rights and the Coase theorem. According to the economist Ronald Coase, Coase's theorem, parties will bargain to address any externality related inefficiencies if property rights are clearly stated and transaction costs are minimal. For instance, downstream users who have a right to clean water might bargain with the business to lessen the pollution if the plant contaminates the river. In actuality, though, transaction costs can be considerable and resolving these issues might need judicial action as well. Now, what is the need for property rights and what is the tragedy of the commons? A notion which is known as the tragedy of commons describes how excessive usage of shared resources occurs when property rights are unclear. Without distinct ownership, people are motivated to use resources as much as possible, which causes resource depletion and long-term harm. By linking personal incentives with the sustainable use of resources, property rights, whether via private ownership or by group management, they can help to ameliorate this issue. Property rights, how can it be used as a tool for internalization of externalities? When one party's activities negatively impact another's well-being without receiving recompensation, this is known as an externality. By holding the owner accountable for the expenses and gains of their activities, property rights aid in the internalization of these externalities. For instance, the expenses of pollution are borne by the landowner, encouraging them to reduce the pollutants on their property. This internalization lessens the harmful externalities and encourages the use of resources more effectively. Property rights and effective resource allocation. Properly specified property rights guarantee that resources are utilized by them who value them the most, which improves the efficiency of resource allocation. When there is competition in the market, people and businesses will bid for the resources which will ultimately determine which uses are most valuable. This procedure promotes investment, innovation, and also fuels economic expansion in return. Now, let us discuss how property rights are created, what are the steps and the difficulties involved. The process of establishing property rights is intricate and varies according to the legal, the social and the economic environment. In order to guarantee the recognition, the enforcement and respect of property rights, a number of issues need to be resolved. First amongst them is the documentation and legal acknowledgement. Legal recognition is the first stage in establishing property rights. It entails the state formally acknowledging ownership. Documentation such as property titles, deeds or patents which prove ownership and may be used to enforce rights in the court can be necessary for obtaining this. Securing property rights requires legal acknowledgement, which can be challenging to obtain in places with weak legal systems or conflicting claims. Another problem that may arise is the significance of land registration and titling. In property rights systems, land registration and titling are very essential items, especially for the real estate. Land registration guarantees that these records are accessible and documented, whereas land titling entails the issue of formal documents that acknowledge ownership. Systems for land registration aid in preventing conflicts, lowering frauds and facilitating transactions. Nonetheless, they necessitate efficient management and public confidence. Another aspect here is the social and the cultural barriers to property rights establishment. Establishing property rights can be significantly hampered by social and cultural considerations. Traditional land tenure systems and official legal frameworks may clash in some communities, causing opposition or misunderstanding. Furthermore, the way rights are upheld and who has access to property can be influenced by social norms and power relations. In order to overcome these challenges, property rights reform must be approached collaboratively with consideration for regional traditions. Now, we move on to discuss redistributing and reforming land. Redistributing land is a component of land reform which aims to provide more equitable access and ownership. In situations where there is a strong concentration of land ownership and social and economic inequality, this may be essential. Programs for land reform frequently seek to lower poverty, increase agricultural output, and give land to the undeserved or landless populations. However, it can be challenging to successfully implement land reforms and politically divisive also. Now, what are the conflicts in establishing property rights? Let's take a look at some case studies. Property rights disputes are frequent, especially in places where there are conflicting claims or limited resources. For instance, in post-colonial Africa, land disputes have resulted in protracted hostilities as various tribes defend their ancestral or customary rights. Similar struggles have been waged by indigenous groups in Latin America to have their ancestral lands recognized and to prevent businesses or settlers from encroaching. These case studies demonstrate the difficulties and intricacies of establishing property rights. Now, how do property rights work in the developing nations? Property rights are frequently vague or poorly defined in emerging nations, which presents serious obstacles to social stability and economic growth. In these situations, defending property rights is essential to lowering poverty, encouraging investment, and guaranteeing fair access to the resources. Property rights are essential for economic development. In emerging nations, safe property rights are crucial for economic growth. They offer the framework for investments in real estate, homes, and companies, enabling people and enterprises to obtain financing, increase productivity, and make money. In addition to encouraging sustainable growth and waste reduction, property rights also support the effective use of resources. Now, property rights formation is also difficult in the developing areas. Let us understand how. Creating property rights in emerging nations is fraught with difficulties such as weak legal institutions. It is challenging to uphold property rights in many developing nations due to the lack of adequate funding, ineffectiveness, or corruption of the legal systems. How informal land markets brings up a problem. Without official titles or registration, a sizable amount of land is owned informally in the developing nations. Ownership conflicts and feelings of uneasiness may also result from this. Another problem here is the cultural barriers. Resistance to property rights changes may arise from the inconsistency of traditional land tenure arrangement with formal legal frameworks. Political instability. As governments strive to maintain authority and implement the rule of law, conflicts, civil wars, and political instability can impede efforts to create property rights. Now, the case studies. The following case studies are going to highlight the achievements and shortcomings of property rights reforms in the developing nations. We first talk about the case study of Rwanda. The country has successfully enacted a land registration scheme that has improved agricultural output, decreased conflict, and strengthened tenure security. In Zimbabwe, the country's land reform program, which is typified by the confiscation of farms owned by white people, has drawn heavy criticism for causing both food shortages and economic collapse. In Brazil, attempts to formally recognize property rights in the country's urban slums or favelas have had conflicting outcomes. While several initiatives have succeeded in enhancing living standards, others have been impeded by the inefficiencies and corruption. Now, first let's take a look at the function of NGOs and international organizations also. The reforms pertaining to property rights are greatly aided by non-governmental organizations, that is the NGOs, and international organizations like the United Nations and the World Bank. All these aid governments in the creation of and putting into place efficient property rights systems by offering finance, technical support and policy recommendations. Nevertheless, the effectiveness of these initiatives hinges on regional circumstances and the readiness of governments to accept change. What are the future prospects of property rights in these developing countries? Let's understand. Property rights in emerging nations can endure only if ongoing efforts are made to improve legal frameworks, encourage land registration and titling, and remove social and cultural obstacles. The demand for safe and just property rights will only increase as global issues like urbanization and climate change worsen. To guarantee sustainable and inclusive growth, developing countries must prioritize property rights as a crucial element of their development strategy. Social and cultural aspects of property rights formation. Now, property rights are established in part by social and cultural factors, but the legal frameworks are also important. Establishing property rights frequently involves navigating intricate social factors such as established land tenure arrangements, power relationships and community standards. How the conventional systems of land tenure works? The traditional land tenure systems control who owns and who uses the land in various regions of the world, most notably in Africa, Asia and Latin America. These systems frequently rest on customary law, which may not be technically defined, but is instead passed down through the generations. Although traditional land tenure systems can take many different forms, they frequently entail collective property ownership with individual or family members only having the right to utilize the land, not complete ownership. These methods may clash with the established legal frameworks, making it difficult to establish the property rights. The social norms and the role of power dynamics. The formation of property rights can be strongly influenced by power relations and social norms. Land ownership and resource accessibility are strongly correlated with social standing, gender and power dynamics in many countries. For instance, establishing property rights for women may be hampered by cultural norms that restrict women's ability to inherit or own land. Property rights can be recognized and upheld differently depending upon the power relations in a community. Sometimes strong people or organizations can also impose control over the resources and the territory, making it harder for other people to defend their property rights. Establishing fair property rights frequently requires addressing these power disparities. Now, we move on to discuss the problems that we face in establishing the property rights. The establishment of property rights is a difficult and a complicated process, particularly in emerging nations with weak legal systems, like I already said, little land and intense social and political unrest. Some of the major obstacles include deficient legal systems, competitiveness and shortage of land, property rights conflicts and conflicts after hostilities, political and economic instability and social and cultural hurdles. The ability of people and communities to protect and uphold their property rights is compromised by weak legal systems in the developing nations, which makes it necessary to enhance these systems. Competition and a lack of land can cause conflicts and disagreements over property rights, particularly in the places with abundant natural resources or high population densities. To overcome these issues, efficient land management and conflict resolution procedures are required. Political and economic instability can hinder property rights establishment, creating uncertainty and discouraging investment. Cultural and social barriers such as traditional land tenure systems and gender discrimination complicate the property rights. Addressing these requires inclusive participatory approaches, respecting local customs and promoting the legal reforms requiring inclusive and participatory approaches. Now, I will conclude my observations for the entire lecture. Property rights are fundamental to both legal and economic systems influencing how societies operate. They support social stability, stimulate investment and innovation, and provide legal certainty for economic transactions. Establishing property rights is a complex process that involves social, political and legal obstacles. The concept of property rights has evolved over time, with early human communities sharing resources without formal ownership systems. Property rights are increasingly recognized as essential components of the human rights concept, with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and international treaties emphasizing their importance in preserving homes, livelihoods and cultural assets. With this, we come to the end of today's lecture. Thank you so much for your patient listening.